My name is Sophia. I learned the hard way that the nicest face can hide a weapon. I learned that love can be a slow-acting poison, sweet at first and then corrosive, and that the only kind of victory that tastes clean is the one you plan like a surgeon plans an operation. Precise, bloodless, inevitable. Ethan and I met on a wet Tuesday in November. He was late, of course, always late in a way that made an entrance feel thoughtful rather than careless, holding a coffee like a talisman, apologizing with that crooked smile that hooked me the first second he offered it. We worked at the same architecture firm. He drew impossible buildings and made them look simple to everyone but himself. I admired that in him. Admirable things are seductive when you are young and hungry for models. I was 26 and believed that desire could become destiny if you only set the right intentions. For the first year, everything about us fit the pictures I had kept of a happy life. Dinners at home where he insisted on cooking, walks under sodium streetlights where he told me stories about his childhood, a sleep that was always warm at the edges because he slept on the side closest to the door. He called me his compass. He called me his Sophia, with the slight inflection that made pet names sound like small confessions. I let myself be softened into something I had not been before, willing to wait, willing to plan a future bookend by his face. Then the small fissures opened. It started with absences. He would take late calls in the corridor, hushed, impatient, the kind of voice that sounds practiced. He would erase plans with the same eraser he used on sketches, clean lines where once there had been drafts. Work, he said. Stress. I believed him because he gave me reasons that sounded like landmarks. If someone hands you a map made of plausible excuses, you follow the trail. The real rupture wasn't a fight. It was a Sunday afternoon when I found a lipstick-stained coffee mug in the sink. It belonged to Claire. Claire worked in marketing, the one everyone described as effortless. Hair, smiles, dresses that seemed manufactured to bend light. She had chosen a world where brightness was currency and she spent it liberally. She was also 6 years younger than me and had the kind of optimism I had once possessed. When I asked Ethan about the mug, he looked at me like I had accidentally misread a line of a play. "Oh, Claire found a place on the terrace to work," he said. "She left her mug. Didn't want it to get taken." That night, I went to Claire's desk. Her calendar had a blocked slot for client meeting that matched the date my mug had been washed in our sink. I checked her phone. A small theft, yes, but I had moved like a foot soldier through the belongings of my supposed ally and the proof was there, not yet erased. Messages affectionate, casual from Ethan. I read them quietly, like reading someone else's script. There were emojis that suggested intimacy and a familiarity that wasn't shared with me. There were jokes, references to songs they both liked, inside details. I didn't confront him. The first rule I discovered, and the most difficult to obey, is that rage is more useful as a cold companion than as an immediate outburst. I sat on the edge of our bed and let my hands do the trembling while my thoughts did the meticulous counting. Betrayal is a science of small acts. It accumulates. At first I wanted violence. Small, cinematic hurts that might have satisfied some mythic part of me. Then I considered the alternatives. Devastation that burns twice and leaves your hands charred is not victory. I wanted a triumph that would be clean, cleverly executed, irreversible. So I watched. I learned him by studying his patterns. He had rituals like anyone who believed himself reliable. The second coffee at 11, the playlist he favored while designing facades, the florist on the corner he'd pass on his way to the tram. I mapped those routines into my internal atlas. I then layered them with the ones that belonged to Claire. Where she ate lunch, which bench in the park she favored, which bars hosted her laughter. Layering gave me intersections. An intersection came the next month. A charity gala at the old mill, a tenuous silver of light across the river. Ethan told me he needed the night to finalize a proposal. He kissed the hollow of my neck with the practiced affection of a man who borrows warmth. Claire posted a photo from the gala. A dress that shimmered like someone had stolen a sliver of the moon and stitched it to silk. Ethan's name was absent in the caption. It didn't matter. I kept the photograph. Art of revenge, I decided, begins with silence. I told no one. Not Maya, my best friend who cried at rom-coms and called me brave 5 times a week. Not my mother, who lived with the habit of crushing her worry into food. Silence is an incubator. It breeds precision. My second weapon was patience. I made them believe I was ignorant, oblivious. I smiled at Ethan with a tenderness that was polite, not pleading. I hugged him, cooked his favorite meals, checked the gas and made sure the car had an oil change. I became invisible in all the ways he thought I was already. People betray more boldly when they feel their actions have no consequences. I let him feel that lack like a net. Then came my temporary surrender. I did something small but theatrical. I began to flirt with life in a way that suggested I would not be endlessly available. Nothing loud. I updated my profile photos, frequented a long-closed pottery class, smiled at the idea of my own desirability. If someone is unfaithful, you cannot stoke their conscience by cursing them. Instead, you must remind them what they lost. Men like Ethan respond to scarcity like moths to a different flame. The point is not to make him jealous, it's to complicate his illusions. Claire was careless. She posted a story with Ethan in it once, collapsed on a couch, laughing, a glass of red lipstick on the rim. I watched it alone, the way one watches the small predictable ways seasons shift. I didn't explode. I saved screenshots, dates, timestamps, his words that had once been innocent. I began a file on my laptop. Emails, photos, receipts, a dossier as meticulous as the blueprints Ethan produced at work. Evidence is the backbone of demolition. You cannot topple a building on hope. You need a weight-bearing beam. The breakthrough came when Ethan made a mistake. He left his cloud drive open on our shared laptop. In a folder named Projects, I found a subfolder titled Claire, Personal. Inside were videos and messages. They were not pornographic. The content was worse in a sense, because it was banal. Conversations in half-light, images of hands held under tables, voice notes in which he hashed out plans for trips that were framed as work. There was a rawness there, a sense of his duplicity laid bare. He had been a small god of comfort and certainty to me, but the files revealed him as a man seeking novelty. I didn't run to him with the files like a prosecutor wielding a murder weapon. Instead, I used them as currency. The next stage required leverage beyond humiliation. I wanted a public, undeniable collapse. I wanted him to lose, not merely be exposed. The world is better at believing clear narratives than messy, nuanced truths. If you want to topple a man who built his life on appearances, you attack the scaffolding of his reputation. Ethan's weakness was not just desire. It was vanity. He cared about his name in the firm, about winning the kind of contracts that would get his photo in architecture magazines. His professional credibility depended on the facade of integrity. I started there. I fabricated a story, not a lie as most people imagine lies, but a crafted truth that would be impossible to ignore. I approached Claire first, as quietly as one might approach a stray animal. She was less guarded than I expected. In coffees at a local bistro, she confessed to things I already knew but wanted to hear spell out loud, perhaps to soothe the cognitive dissonance. She had called him at 1 a.m, and he had answered. She had met him at the old mill. She had believed they were together in private. She was angry, but also frightened. "He's dangerous when he's cornered," she said once, and I made a note. She was afraid of him, not because he had raised his hand but because he had raised his voice into a corner where someone's life could be reshaped. With Claire's reluctant help, I began to see details that would grow. I contacted a journalist I found through a friend, not to sell the story, but to plant questions, to suggest there might be more to Ethan's neat life than the public saw. Journalists love patterns. A shadow of a rumor is an invitation. I fed that shadow a breadcrumb trail, a cancelled trip with a client, a donation listed under a different name, a discrepancy in an expense report. I fed it to the right inboxes. At the same time, I set about destabilizing the corridors where Ethan's reputation mattered most, the firm. I created an anonymous dossier that implied he had manipulated budgets for personal gains. I included the photos, the timestamps, the mild, professional emails that could be interpreted as coercion. I planted the idea that someone reliable had been compromised because of a personal indulgence. People in positions of power protect their own skin first. They will cut away an infected limb if it keeps the body alive. The firm reacted swiftly. Not because they loved me, but because reputations are swift tinder. Ethan was called into meetings with human resources. He was asked the sort of questions that have little mercy. Who knew? Who signed off? Why was your private life intersecting with company assets? He confessed to minor affairs, to reckless late-night calls, to sloppy expense reports. He folded like someone realizing too late that domestic life sometimes bears a public cost. He thought the damage could be contained. Pride, like a recursive lie, Gives people hope that something that goes wrong is temporary. He tried to apologize to me, solemn and small, his voice a parched leaf. Sophia, it was a mistake. I don't know what came over me. I love you. Love, I said, and it was the first time I'd used the word back in months, but stripped of ritual. Love comes with responsibility. He promised change. But the firm was no longer listening to him alone. The partners wanted damage control. His name, once clean, had cracks now that light could penetrate. Contracts were postponed. A client withdrew. The press smelled blood in an otherwise ordinary story of infidelity. I could have stopped there and watched him dismantle his own life. That would have been enough for some. But I wanted not just a fall, but a kind of denouement that left no room for his return. I wanted a final act that would be incontrovertible. A legal consequence, a social exile, a professional ostracization so complete that he'd have to build from ground zero. To do that, I needed to expand the narrative beyond cheating. Cheating is morally contemptible, but in most legal systems it is not punishable. I had to find a lever that led to something undeniably actionable. A pattern of coercion, misuse of position, sexual harassment, these were cylinders of law. I considered fabricating claims but stopped. I would not become the villain of my own story. Instead, I searched for truths that would align with legal redress. One evening, after another argument in which he oscillated between remorse and entitlement, I found a packet of receipts in his coat. They were for expensive dinners, for train tickets bought at odd hours, for a cab company we didn't use. More importantly, at the bottom of the stack was a receipt from a hotel near the firm's temporary project site. The date aligned with a proposal meeting during which Ethan had billed time to the firm. If he had billed travel and lodging to the firm while using the project as cover for personal meetings, that could be fraud. I consulted an attorney under the guise of a friend who wanted to understand employment law. I fed facts to that attorney and watched the legal scaffolding reveal itself. Misuse of company funds, coercion suggested by messages that implied promises of career favor in exchange for silence, an implicit quid pro quo. I also approached Claire again and asked if she would be willing to support a complaint about being groomed through promises of professional openings. I gave her the option to refuse. She agreed, trembling and relieved to have someone else shoulder the moral burden of truth. The complaint was filed anonymously at first. Then, with Claire and two other women, colleagues who had been quietly marginalized by Ethan's charm, we moved forward. The firm responded with an internal investigation. The emails I had saved, the receipts, the documented overlaps between professional meetings and private rendezvous began to appear in official documents. People who had previously ignored gossip now had formal papers in front of them. That matters. Paper is the kind of pressure that crushes even the slickest defenses. Ethan began to fall apart in a way that was almost suspiciously picturesque. He was called to meetings where quiet men in navy suits told him his actions violated policy. He called me, voice rougher than I'd ever heard. Sophia, they're overreacting, he said. You know how people are. It's nothing. Nothing. I asked. There was a moment of silence and then he laughed. A man forced to mimic humor. You can't be serious. You should have thought about that before you used my life as disposable, I said. I told him I had filed things too, not out of vengeance but out of a need for closure. This ends the way you built it. In public. When the investigation became public, the press did what the press does best. They polished edges. For a week, the city's cultural pages were a carousel of scandal and gossip. I read the articles in the quiet of our living room, where the blinds were drawn and the lights felt too bright. Ethan called me names on the phone and then cried, which felt like both an insult and a confession. Victory is an odd taste. It is not celebratory. It is cold and factual. The partner who had once praised Ethan's eye for materials told him he was being let go. Clients wanted to distance themselves. A lawsuit was filed. It would take time to be resolved, but the initial shock was enough. People who had wanted nothing to do with messy emotional stuff had legal documents that insisted emotion had spilled into professional fraud. In the weeks that followed, the city's gossip could not rebuild him. He tried to make amends in public, to craft a narrative in which he was the repentant man who made a human mistake. But he had used the firm like an accessory. Accessories are disposable. And yet, despite all of this, the hardest part of winning was the small private reckonings that continued to hammer on the ribs. I had wanted him to feel the weight of his choices. I wanted him to lose what he had used most. Certainty, The idea that the world was a place where people could be bent without consequence. He lost that. But there were nights when he would stand at the doorway and watch, perhaps imagining that my endurance might crack. He watched me the way you watch a painting whose meaning you once thought you understood. The endgame, the part that made the narrative airtight, came when the court case began. Claire stood up and told her truth. 2 other witnesses described patterns that mapped onto the fabric of his professional life. The judge, not given to theatrics, read the documents and assigned penalties for misuse of funds and professional misconduct. There were fines, a reputational ban from certain professional associations, and a settlement that meant Ethan would not design projects for a long time. The firm had to show it had acted responsibly. The press called it a fall from grace. I called it closure. After it was over, Ethan moved out. He left in a flurry of boxes and apologies and a final attempt to explain himself, as if an explanation could ever be a bridge back to what he had demolished. "I didn't realize the impact," he said at the doorway, "the way a man says, 'I'm sorry' to a car he has dented." "You did," I said. "You just decided the benefits outweighed the cost." His last look at me was the look of a man surprised that the person he took for granted had become his adversary. He left with the dignity of someone who still believed life would be forgiving. That faith would be his challenge now. Victory did not make me lighter. It made me quieter. Once the gavel had fallen and the headlines receded, I found myself with the kind of silence that is both balm and barometer. I had won in the sense that the structures he had relied on had crumbled. I had constructed my justice out of evidence and restraint. But I also carried the weight of what it had taken to get there. The patience, the secrecy, the slow erosion of the man I had loved. People asked me later if I felt satisfied. They wanted the volcanic response, the scream, the retribution that television dramas promise. In truth, my satisfaction was a series of small, precise moments. The hush in the room when the judge read the words that acknowledged truth. Claire's tearful relief when she admitted she hadn't known how to do it alone. Maya's awkward hug that said, finally, she believed me. Satisfaction was more like a set of administrative acts. Emails sent, reports filed, receipts lodged. It was the procedural language of justice, not the romance of revenge. I didn't relish his suffering. I pitied it. Suffering is a blunt instrument. What I cherished instead was reclaiming my autonomy. The evenings that were mine, the phone that no longer carried whoever it was he had become, the quiet of drawing a line in the sand and refusing to step back. I learned the economy of boundaries. I learned that power does not always shout. Sometimes it organizes. In private, after the trial, I burned the last of the receipts. I didn't keep them as trophies. They were relics of a time when someone else's choices had been allowed to shape my life. The ash was cool and gray, and as it sifted through my fingers, I understood that ending any story requires a letting go as much as a taking hold. Months later, I moved my desk to the other side of the apartment. I repainted the wall the color of wet cement, a neutral that didn't demand emotion. I took a job designing a community center in a part of the city that had no buildings to call for architects. Only empty lots and potential. Building something from scratch felt steadier than dismantling even the most charismatic failure. Sometimes, walking past a cafe where I knew Claire had once sat with a lipstick-stained mug, I paused. We made eye contact, shared a tight smile that acknowledged the transaction of our alliance. We didn't exchange details. We didn't need to. Survival creates a sisterhood of sorts in those who understand what it means to navigate betrayal. Ethan's name became a word people used to warn each other. Watch out for the man who promises the moon and charges for daylight. I didn't want his ruin to be a cautionary tale that made me proud. I wanted it to be a lesson, that actions have consequences, and that dignity once cultivated will not permit itself to be crushed without a rigorous accounting. If you ask me whether I would do it again, whether I would engineer the same slow excavation of someone's life, I would not offer a categorical answer. Revenge is an instrument with a double edge. It can sever what needs severing, but it can also cut you if you're careless. I was careful. I knew exactly where to press and where to stop. My victory was not a theatrical triumph. It was a surgical conclusion. My name is Sophia. I was betrayed. I planned. I acted. I won. The winning did not make me holy or heartless. It made me sure. It taught me the value of evidence, of time, of letting someone's own arrogance hasten their downfall. It taught me that the most effective revenge is not brutality, but a sequence of quiet, relentless truths that an unjust life cannot survive. And in the end, that was enough. The city has a way of pretending everything is ordinary. The tram bells ring, the bakery on the corner still opens at 7, and pigeons still argue over stale bread. The public parts of my life return to a slow, careful normal. Colleagues said the right things, acquaintances tilted their heads and murmured sympathy, and the world moved on with the neat indifference of machinery. But endings are rarely absolute. They bruise and then echo. Ethan's fall had been steep, but people who have lost everything sometimes become the most dangerous kind of thing. Not the swaggering predator but the patient who learns how to wait. In the months after the trial, I assumed my meticulous planning had sealed him away. He had been silenced professionally, and his social scaffolding had been dismantled. His phone numbers changed. He moved into a smaller room in a flat far from the center. He was, for all appearances, broken. I let myself believe that for a while. Then the small, precise disruptions began. At first they were wrong deliveries. A package left at our door with no return address. A torn sleeve of a shirt I recognized as mine though it had never been worn. Later, the disturbances became curiously intimate. Photographs slipped under my door of places I had visited months before, snapshots of me leaving the pottery class, a single thread of my scarf twisted around the latch of my mailbox. The evidence was not meant to frighten by violence. It was meant to remind me that his surveillance did not rely on stature or law but on stamina. I told myself it wasn't him. Men cling to the idea that their enemies are their equals. I wanted to believe a stalker could have been a petty admirer or an opportunistic stranger. But there is a scent to familiarity. When a person knows your favorite coffee order, your exact walk home, the way you tilt your head when you think, that knowledge is not learned in a week. It is accrued. It is intimate. I reported the incidents. The police took notes. They offered the procedural comforts of forms and numbers and advised I change my locks. The legal world has limits. It recognizes what is demonstrable. The law wants things to be black and white. Stalking is often gradations of gray. I improved my lights, installed cameras with motion sensors, and began to sleep with the blinds closed like armor. But paranoia is a tricky companion. It teaches you to read faces for motives and to inventory every sound. It also affords strange lucidity. I became aware of how my muscles remembered the shape of a threat. I learned how to angle the street lamps so my shadow did not precede me. It was not the life of revenge I had imagined when I drafted those first blueprints of justice. It was a life in which vigilance became the new normal. One night, a message arrived on an anonymous email address I had created for the case, the kind you make because you know bureaucracy can be messy and you want a private channel. The message was a single line. You think you stopped me. No signature. No context. My heart thudded inside my ribs like a trapped thing. There was something childish in the taunt and something methodical. He had never been content with private transgression. He always wanted an audience. Even now, in the ruins, he wanted to be seen. I considered contacting Claire, thinking that any attempt to intimidate me might be an attempt to isolate my witnesses. Claire had moved jobs. She took a position at a startup downtown, and the last time we met for coffee her hands trembled as if from nicotine or anxiety. He sends me things sometimes, she admitted with a fury that looked like shame. Photos of the office. Notes about how things used to be. I throw them away. She was trying to rebuild something too. A life where her choices didn't belong to someone else's ledger. She didn't want to be pulled back into the litigation, which could reopen civic wounds and emotional bruises. She was, in her relief, fragile. I began to suspect that Ethan had not acted alone. Power's derangement can breed recruits. Friends who still owed favors, colleagues who harbored grudges, and men who see instability as invitation. I found a name in a small forum. An architecture enthusiast board where people traded insider jokes about our firm. There were comments under a thread about the trial, thinly veiled accusations and threats. The usernames were anonymous, but the language matched the cadence of a few men I had heard at after-work drinks. People who retreat to groupthink find safety in numbers. I didn't want to drag more people into the mud. Yet the approach that had worked before, assembling documents, building a paper trail, remained my most useful tool. I documented everything. I traced the package's postage. I saved the emails and forwarded them to my attorney. I notified the firm that the harassment had not ended. The partners, some of whom had been inclined to distance themselves from the scandal, shifted in ways I recognized now as caution. They, too, had reputations to protect. Then came the escalation. Not violent, but efficient. A smear campaign. Someone started an online thread alleging that my complaints were fabrications, that I had fabricated evidence for attention and revenge. The thread was seeded with details only someone close to the case would know. My private life, which I had carved into small, controllable documents, was now being parsed by strangers who would believe the most sensational headline. I understood then the true architecture of revenge. It is not only about toppling an individual but about rewriting the narrative so that truth becomes doubted. People are more comfortable with neat villains than ambivalent ones. If Ethan could pollute public perception of me, he might undercut the very testimony that had toppled him. So I changed tactics. Where he sought to erode, I sought to fortify. I gathered sympathetic voices, not to craft a spectacle but to reconstruct context. Maya, who had been my friend since university, wrote an op-ed about the cultural cost of minimizing women's experiences in workplaces. A small feminist collective I had never met offered to host a panel on harassment in creative industries. Claire agreed to speak anonymously on the record for an investigative podcast. Each piece was a small brick, some visible, some concealed. At the same time, I refined my surveillance. The cameras I had installed collected patterns. The window where someone had stood waiting for me, the call logs to unknown numbers, a taxi that had circled my street more than once. There was a person in one of the frames who looked like a courier. Broad shoulders, a hoodie, a slouched hat. The footage was grainy but consistent. I took screenshots and brought them to a private investigator. A woman named Katarzyna whose accent was gentle but whose methods were exact. She had worked on cases like mine, cases that straddled the line between personal vendetta and criminal intent. Katarzyna found what we were missing. She traced a trail of small money transfers from an account that had been seeded with payments withdrawn from a card Ethan had access to months before he left. A man, not Ethan, but someone on the periphery of his social orbit, had been paid to do the dirty work. Deliveries, threats, digital harassment. He was a petty criminal with a record, a man who worked for the kind of money that buys temporary loyalty. He was also, crucially, someone we could link to Ethan through financial traces and messages. Confrontation is a funny thing. It is both more terrifying and less dramatic than you imagine. When we went to the police with the new evidence, there was a different energy in the room. It is one thing to hand over a photograph of a lipstick-stained mug. It is another to show receipts and bank transfers that map the motion of a conspiracy. The officers listened with the seriousness of people obliged, finally, to act. Ethan was arrested on charges related to harassment and conspiracy. The man who had been paid to do the work was taken in too. For the first time since the trial, I felt the satisfaction of systems working as they should. Evidence collected, connections made, accountability enacted. It wasn't a triumph so much as a relief. The legal machinery is slow, and its gears are indifferent, but they grind on. Behind bars, Ethan became quieter. The letters he sent were fewer and more contrite. Sometimes they read like admissions, sometimes like pleas for mercy. He wrote about learning, about regret, about therapy he claimed to attend. I kept the letters in a drawer for a while, then burned them in the sink like old receipts. They made me nauseous because they mixed genuine remorse with the old habit of centering himself in every story. The public smear began to recede as facts reasserted themselves. The forum's moderator removed the thread. The podcast presented Claire's testimony with care. People who had once nodded at gossip now confronted the complexity of complicity. It didn't undo the damage, no media repair does, but it diluted the malice into something more recognizable, a cautionary tale about power and consequence. And yet, victory here was once again partial. The scarring was not only public. It lived in the small solitudes of habit. I had become a person who checked locks twice, a person who flinched when a car slowed behind me, a person who preferred the cool distance of day to the vulnerable hush of night. I had won on paper and in court, but I had also learned the currency of vigilance. There is a cost to learning how to protect yourself, and sometimes that cost is the casual abandon of peace. Weeks turned into months, and I grew more deliberate about how to live. I resumed the community center project with renewed focus, letting my designs be what they were meant to be. Useful, public, reparative. I hosted a workshop on safe workplaces in collaboration with the firm and other NGOs. I taught young architects about ethics and boundaries. Teaching was a strange balm. Explaining to others how to avoid traps made my own recovery feel purposeful. Claire and I met occasionally, sometimes at the cafe where she'd once left her lipstick-stained mug. We would sit in silence and then in conversation, taking comfort in mundane things like the way the barista spelled our names and the way the late sun hit the pastry shelf. We were not reconciled in the sense of forgetting. We were comrades in a small war that had taught us how to stand. One late autumn evening, while the city threw gold onto the pavement, I walked past a new building. A slender apartment complex that had replaced an old workshop. A man and a woman argued on the sidewalk, voices raised but human, the kind of argument that ends with someone buying coffee and making up before the tram comes. I watched them for a moment, not because I longed for the life I once had, but because I wanted to know whether I could still feel hope without fear. There is an absurd grace in survival. The ability to continue, to taste the small pleasures in a life that has been complicated by cruelty. I will not pretend revenge was the only vessel of truth. It was a mechanism I used to reclaim agency. But what followed it, the slow mending, the relearning of how to trust my own instincts without letting them calcify into paranoia, was in its own way the deeper victory. If this wasn't the end, then what followed was not another confrontation but a continuation of living. Building, teaching, guarding, and occasionally laughing at things that had nothing to do with justice. Ethan existed now as a caution at the edges of my memory. A man who once promised me constellations and paid for them with cruelty. He had been defeated in the ways that mattered. His leverage removed, his threats exposed, his network revealed. But the more telling victory was not his fall. It was my capacity to exist after it. The story doesn't end with a close. It continues like a building under construction, scaffolding sometimes visible, sometimes not, progress marked more by small, steady gestures than by a single climactic event. I learned to accept the scaffolding. I learned that endings are often drafts, and drafts can be revised. And if the city taught me one lesson, it's this. Life rebuilds itself around the ruins, and whether the new structure is fragile or formidable depends, in the end, on how carefully you set the foundation. It took me a year to stop looking over my shoulder. By then, Ethan was nothing but a whisper, someone's cautionary anecdote, a face that appeared in articles about corporate misconduct. The world had already moved on to newer scandals. The court case was closed. The restraining order expired. The nightmares faded, mostly. But the silence he left behind had teeth. At first, I didn't know what to do with peace. It felt unnatural, like standing in a room after a storm where everything is dry, too clean, too still. The kind of stillness that makes you wait for thunder again. Revenge had been a purpose, and purpose, once achieved, leaves a vacuum. I filled it with work. The community center I designed opened that spring. It wasn't glamorous, just a clean building of concrete and glass, full of light, with walls that didn't echo. I stood there the morning it opened, watching people walk through the doors. Children, parents, an old man with trembling hands holding a newspaper. They didn't know who built it. They didn't need to. That anonymity felt healing. For the first time in a long while, I was building something that wasn't a trap. Maya said I smiled differently now. Less like someone pretending to be okay. More like someone who had stopped auditioning for forgiveness. Maybe she was right. I had stopped needing to prove I was the victim, or the hero, or anything. I was simply alive. And that was enough. One afternoon, I received a letter. No return address, but the handwriting was neat, almost hesitant. For a second, my stomach twisted. Old reflexes. But the letter wasn't from Ethan. It was from Claire. She wrote that she had moved abroad, started over. She thanked me, not for the revenge, but for forcing her to see herself not as collateral, but as a survivor. She ended the letter with a single line that I still keep on my desk. Justice doesn't heal you, Sophia. It just stops the bleeding. The rest is your own work. She was right. Justice doesn't make you whole. It just gives you room to heal in peace. So I began the slow work of forgiving. Not him, never him, but myself. For the blindness. For the anger. For the parts of me that enjoyed watching him fall. Because those parts, if left unchecked, could turn me into what I hated most. I didn't want to be defined by the fire. I wanted to be defined by what I built after it. Sometimes I walk by the river at night. The city lights ripple across the surface like broken glass, and I think about all the versions of myself that drowned trying to love the wrong man. They're still there, under the surface. Ghosts, quiet, patient, but they no longer own me. I'm not the same woman who discovered a lipstick-stained mug in her kitchen. I'm not the woman who plotted in silence. And I'm not the woman who stood in court with shaking hands, waiting for justice to sound like salvation. I'm someone else now. Sharper, calmer, dangerous in a quieter way. If there's a moral to my story, it's this. Revenge is not the opposite of forgiveness. It's a bridge. You cross it to reach the other side, and once you do, you never look back. Because if you keep standing on that bridge, you'll eventually fall with it. Ethan built lies. I built consequences. But now I build homes. And that finally feels like victory.